I hope I don't offend too many people, but you're really the best because you have this election law stuff.
I paid you a lot for that. I paid a lot.
You did. You paid a lot. Okay, so I'm going to just let Rachel introduce herself for a second while I put all these feeds up here and I get them all put in the thing. So Rachel, tell me a little bit. You're in Arizona. So tell us about your experience in Arizona, and then we'll get into the status of all of these states that are up for grabs.
Well, what's going on here in Arizona is, in my opinion, actually better than what's going on in the other swing states. Because, first of all, our governor is holding back on calling the state for Biden. In our state, we have not yet certified the vote for Biden, unlike, I believe Pennsylvania was trying to, Michigan has, and Nevada has. And we're going to be starting our own legislative hearings on Monday. So we have a very aggressive state Republican Party. It's no longer controlled by the McCainiacs. It's run by Kelly Ward, who has been a solid conservative. And so I have high hopes here. We've got two different lawsuits going. Not just one from the Republican Party, Kelly Ward, state GOP, but we've got a lawsuit going from Trump. So there's a lot in play here still.
All right, now that's Arizona. What at this point, given the spread between Biden and Trump, how much does he actually have to succeed either at the legislature or at the court level to put the electoral vote in doubt for Arizona?
I believe we have the same law that we do in most other states, which is that you have to show that it would have made a difference in the total counts. So here in Arizona, Biden is supposedly ahead by a little over 10,000 votes. So we merely need to show that, and we can already show that, I know, from a lot of the ballots that were returned and then accepted, even though they did not pass the signature test. And so that specifically is what the state Republican Party is challenging. They want to go look at the signatures.
And they have not been given access to the signatures, right?
As far as I know, I don't believe they have yet. That's still pending in court.
All right, so let's just now jump right into the thick of it. There are 6 states at play, from what I understand. We can talk at some point, if we have time, about some of the other states, Virginia, New Mexico, Massachusetts, and possibly California, where there are also lawsuits. But the most important are Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Georgia, Arizona, and Nevada, right? So if you take those
4 states, correct?
Right. You take those 6 states together, and it is crystal clear that there is the possibility that there will be enough electoral votes either switched to Trump or suppressed from Biden, that Biden will not be over the 270 mark, and this is headed for the House of Representatives. All right. So that's our beginning point. Let's begin with Pennsylvania. We had pretty extensive hearings in Pennsylvania. I think the reaction was diametrically opposite, which is not surprising. Conservatives walked away from that feeling as though there was a wealth of evidence that was provided, and our case seems really strong. Liberals are saying the hearings weren't that important, and the decision by the appeals court 2 days later basically nullified any advantage that we have from that. What is your reading from the Pennsylvania hearings, and where is Pennsylvania headed right now?
I think the Pennsylvania hearings were tremendous. I was down thinking Trump didn't have a chance at all, 10% chance. And I'm back up to thinking he's got a 20 or 30% chance after listening to those hearings. The left is so desperate after hearing, what went on in Pennsylvania with those hearings, that they are now not even calling them a hearing. They are saying that it was just like an election show, a Trump thing, And the reality is, you go look at the Pennsylvania state legislature's website, and they call it a hearing. Just because this committee that held it, had it in a building located in Gettysburg, which I'm guessing they did, just to make a political statement, doesn't mean it wasn't an official hearing. And, this latest judge, in Pennsylvania that has ruled against, the lawsuits, that doesn't matter because it all comes down to the Supreme Court. And we all knew that most of these lawsuits, and by the way, Trump is getting some victories with these federal district court judges. The mainstream media just isn't reporting them. So that's actually astonishing considering a lot of these judges lean to the left. A lot of Republican appointee judges lean to the left. Our side has a bad habit of doing that. But it doesn't matter. Every single one can rule against them, just like what happened in 2000. Every single judge ruled against Bush until it got to the Supreme Court.
All right. Okay. So in Pennsylvania, we're talking about Pennsylvania first. It seems as though there are two different things at play. There's the legislature trying to assert its constitutional rights under Article 2 of the Constitution. And then there are the courts, right? Those are the two balls that are in the air in Pennsylvania. Looking at it from the legislature's point of view, I felt after seeing the hearings that I saw sufficient evidence to say that they can't be certified. I don't know, we can't declare that Trump won or Biden won, but to me, the vote that exists can't be certified because too many of those ballots were completely not secured and were handled in a way that was open for abuse and graft. So I could see the legislature making the political point that we should decertify under the Constitution. I am not a lawyer. So when this goes to the courts, I think the thing that I want to get from you is who has the burden of proof here? Because I think if the burden of proof is on the pro-Trump people, then we're in trouble because we can't really prove past a reasonable doubt that specific individuals committed the fraud because we just don't have the paper trail. They covered their tracks. Right? But if the burden of proof falls upon the election officials to show that their tallies had a provenance that was certain and that was secure, then it seems like we have a good chance. So who has the burden of proof when these particular pleadings make their way up through the court system?
Well, as I understand it, yes, our side does have the burden of proof, but it's not beyond a reasonable doubt. That's in a criminal trial. This is merely civil at this point, and so I believe the standard would be a preponderance of evidence. And basically, now we're getting into what is the meaning of evidence. In law, evidence includes things like affidavits. And, during the Pennsylvania hearing, we saw testimony after testimony after testimony from all these people who witnessed the fraud and saw the fraud. And so, in my opinion, that clearly could constitute a preponderance of the evidence on our side.
Okay, so that means that we do have a shot both in the courts and in the legislature. I have seen a lot of people. I just saw a tweet from Denny Burke. He's one of these people in the Southern Baptist world who sometimes looks like he's a brave warrior. Sometimes he looks like he's a hack for the establishment. I don't know. I can't tell. I can't see what's in his heart. But he said that Trump is going to lose at the Supreme Court 9-0. What do you think?
Like we're going to win 9-0?
No, he thinks Trump's going to lose, that all 9 justices, with the exception of possibly Barrett, are going to say that we don't have a case.
Absolutely not. And I'm firmly confident about that. I mean, we have such a strong case. I've never seen so much felonious election fraud in my life. I can't keep track of it. There are so many different ways the Democrats committed fraud, and there are so many numerical impossibilities, statistical impossibilities. It's a flat and shut case. So when you just asked me that, I thought you meant the Supreme Court was going to go 9-0 in favor of Trump. So I think Roberts is the wild card, but we don't need him. We just need 5-4.
Right. Okay. So let's go on now to Michigan. That's the big one. Sidney Powell filed an extensive brief. I looked through it. I tried to get my head around all of it. I'm convinced by it because there seems to be so much that looks bad and that we have right in front of us. It seems like there are a lot of receipts for this one. In the Michigan case, it seems very clear that in multiple districts that were the key districts that turned the corner for Biden, there were more votes counted than there were people who could have possibly been registered in those districts. So how strong do you get behind Sidney Powell's brief in Michigan? Do you think that was a well-constructed brief? Was it done mostly to just get the information out there in the court of public opinion, or do you think this has legs legally speaking?
Oh, it absolutely has legs. I mean, I don't know if you know much about her record and how many successful appeals she filed as an appellate lawyer. Call myself an election lawyer, blah, blah, blah. I briefly practiced law, and only a total of 12 years. This woman has practiced it her entire career. She worked for the Department of Justice, and she has, these numerous high-profile victories under her belt when she moved over to the private sector and defended all these innocent people who were being prosecuted. And, she said she wouldn't have filed this if she wasn't 100% sure. So, I mean, what she's filed is incredible. And, the only thing I can, guess why the Trump campaign distinguished themselves from her and said that they were separate is because there's just so much felony fraud to try to, go after all of it. It's just too much work. And, with Republican lawyers being threatened off the case right and left, they are running out of lawyers. So they had to, focus on just a few things. And, I had this friend tweet me, saying, why did Sidney Powell have some spelling and grammatical errors in her brief? And I just responded back and said, are you kidding me? Like, people don't understand what she has had to do. It's so monumental, and so much incredible work. And she's got hardly any staff left at this point, I'm sure, because so many have been chased off of it. Really? You're going to notice a couple spelling errors and grammatical errors?
I love the fact that there were spelling errors in it, because it's exactly the kind of thing. If she were trying to gaslight the left, that's the perfect way to do it, because they're going to get so focused on that. They're going to strain at a gnat and swallow the camel, and then that's better because it makes it easier for us to take them by surprise on that one. In Michigan, the issue here is that the legislature, who decided to certify the vote ultimately, was that passed by the legislature, or was it by the election commissioners or the governor? And how were they able to do that when the largest county, Wayne County, there were the two electors who said they were going to certify it and then rescinded their vote? How can any of that stand? Because what we keep on hearing is that in Michigan, they've already certified the vote, so there's no going back. Can you explain to us where that stands, and where does the certification really stand? And I think that applies also to Pennsylvania, another state where we're constantly being told that it's already been certified, so we can't go back. I mean, how does that work exactly?
As I understand it, it's the legislature itself, and then the governor signs off on the certification. But don't quote me. I haven't double checked that lately, but that's the process. And it can also be undone. It can be undone anytime. And so that's why I find it odd that President Trump has said if all the states, certify by the deadline for certification, which I believe is December 13th or 14th, he said he will concede. Because I don't think that is a complete hard and fast deadline. Anything can change that. We all know in January they can throw the election to the House, which will then, allow each state delegation to vote. So I don't see why everyone thinks that's such a black and white deadline. But I do understand Trump's reasoning, which is that the longer this goes on, the slimmer his chances get. And at some point, he needs to start saving money, because they're going to be coming after him, trying to put him in prison.
All right. Now, in both Michigan and in Pennsylvania, there were hard numbers that seemed very hard to get past. For instance, in Pennsylvania, they made that announcement that there were 1.5 million ballots that were, or absentee ballots that were processed, but then there were 2.5 million reported in the count. So there was this big gap. And we find a similar thing in Detroit. The numbers look hot, red hot. They got caught, no doubt about it. But I keep on seeing on Twitter these people with these screenshots saying, no, that's not the actual number. Actually, here is the vote count. Where are these screenshots coming from? Do you have any sense at all of what the real numbers were? Were those numbers authentic that they presented before Pennsylvania? And that goes as well for the numbers that Sidney Powell attached in her brief.
Well, what I keep noticing is when we come out and find numbers like this that show more people voted than were registered voters, what the left does is they go back and they find a screenshot in time when there were different, totals of numbers that had come in and been counted versus registered voters. So you have to go back and nitpick them to find out exactly how they're coming to this, different conclusion showing there was no fraud, because you can, it's follow the trail. And, they've been dishonest the whole way through. And, they take advantage of the fact that most of us don't think to go back and trace the numbers back.
Okay, now in the case of Michigan, they're also having hearings next week, early next week. Are those of the same nature that we saw in Pennsylvania, or are those different? This is the same thing where one of the committees in the state legislature is going to hold hearings. Is that correct? And does that also have the ability to sway the election count in Michigan?
I know it's official. I can't remember if it's an actual committee that's going to hold the hearing or whether it's the entire state legislature.
All right. Okay. So let's move now. Part of the Michigan case dealt also with the testimonials about the strange occurrences with people reporting that they were feeding ballots in multiple times. They had a stack of 50 and they fed it through multiple times. Have you seen any evidence presented to counter that, or any substantial explanation for that? That was an important key part of it. That's the first part of the question I wanted to ask you. And the second part is, are you worried that we don't have any photographs of this van pulling up at 4 a.m. in the morning with all of the ballots? In an age of cell phones, I get a little bit anxious when that testimony about how they delivered these thousands of ballots on pallets at 4 o'clock in the morning, that testimony finds its way into our arguments, but I haven't seen photographs of it yet. So can you speak to those two issues? Number one, has there been any counter testimony to these people who report having seen all these strange occurrences? And number two, are you worried about the lack of the photographs for these things?
Well, on the first one, no, that's a good point. I hear a lot from the left. I have a lefty friend I chat every day, and he comes up with every counter argument. And so I've never heard any evidence. I think they're just hoping people will forget about that and it will just go away. But what's hurting them is we're now finding people not only testifying that they witnessed that type of behavior, but they are testifying that they participated in it. That gets even more difficult for them to refute. Now, while you say that about the fact that we have no, say, video evidence of people dropping off these ballots in the middle of the night, right, okay, we need to get to the bottom of that. Are there security cameras outside the building, inside the building? Somebody needs to get to the bottom of that. But you know what? That's just the left trying to add a higher barrier to evidence that you don't actually need. Once you have witness testimony, especially if it's witnesses that have participated in it, that's enough. I remember when I was at the prosecutor's office, one thing that used to drive our office crazy was what we called the CSI effect. That is that crime show that always showed that crimes were solved with DNA evidence. And it really affected juries because juries then thought from then on out, you can't find somebody guilty of a crime unless you have DNA evidence. No, it's beyond a reasonable doubt. It's the standard. It's not, this high level of evidence is needed to, show that something happened.
Right. Okay. And then in both states, in Michigan and in Pennsylvania, there are so many different testimonies that have come out that reflect the fact that there seems to be concertation and intent. That is to say, there were people who physically corralled the observers far away, or who knowingly refused to explain to them what was going on with the ballots, or who seemed to have the intent to segregate out ballots that were for a certain candidate from others. If we show intent, does that give us the ability to bring in all of the circumstantial evidence of these officials who have made all of these anti-Trump statements? Are we allowed to bring in then all of the suspicious behavior by the people in the media who have shown this long-term hostility to Trump? Or is that basically not going to help us with the larger legal case?
Well, it helps, but the problem is the standard is can you show that that would have changed the number of votes in order to change the election results? And you can't just say, well, 6 Republican observers were told to stand 20 feet away. You can't translate that into numbers of votes that it would have changed.
Okay, all right. Can we move now to Georgia? I don't know if you have followed a lot with Georgia. Sidney Powell also filed a very extensive lawsuit in Georgia. Lynn Wood filed a separate lawsuit. Apparently, he's not working with either of those two teams. He's not working with Team Trump or with Team Powell. He's working independently. He was given an expedited review by the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals. What does that mean, and what effects does Lynn Wood's case have on the larger plan of things?
Well, it all comes down to the judges. The judges could say, you have no interest. I mean, they can just randomly pick and choose and say, okay, you don't have any interest because you don't live in this state, or you don't have any interest because you're just a voter, you're not an actual elector, or I mean, it gets really arbitrary. And so that's why whatever the 11th Circuit rules, even if it agrees to hear the case, it's not going to matter. What's going to matter is if the U.S. Supreme Court accepts Lynn Wood's case and decides to decide it on the merits.
All right. Now, from what I understand with Sidney Powell's brief that she filed, she's asking for an injunction. Can you explain what that means? The injunction actually involves throwing out the vote, right? Throwing out the results, or not being able to certify them. What's the difference between an injunction and a ruling against somebody? Just for those of us who are not lawyers.
Well, an injunction is just a temporary thing that happens. And by the way, in Sydney's injunction, oh my gosh, she has asked for like 15 things, not just not certifying the vote, but, changing the vote over to Trump, and, investigating the machines and counting the votes again. And I mean, she's asked for a million things. So an injunction is just a temporary thing in the middle of litigation, and it doesn't resolve the whole thing like a court decision dismissing the lawsuit or ruling for the plaintiffs or against the plaintiffs would do. It's just gonna stop the proceedings from going the way they are right now. And if it's granted, that's usually a really good sign for the person who asked for the injunction.
Okay, now Georgia already had a recount. A lot of us have seen all the reasons why that recount is suspicious. They didn't really check. They didn't do a full audit. They only passed basically the same ballots through the same machine. And we had footage that citizens on the ground shared online that showed that there were materials that were being shredded very suspiciously outside of some of these recount facilities. Does the recount having been concluded make our case more difficult in Georgia?
It does. And what makes it even worse is, I think this is in Sidney Powell's brief, she says the way that Dominion set up its voting machines, you can't actually go and compare what the machine vote made to the original paper ballots. It's deliberately untraceable. So even if they're going back and, trying to trace them, they can't do that. To me, it seems like you need to, rely more on things like their signature on the outside of the envelope, which I assume is the case in Georgia. That's what it is here in Arizona. And that's why we're, looking so hard to get a hold of the signatures. There's a fact out there that if you were to have the same disqualification rate for ballots that we had 4 years ago, which was like 3% instead of this, 0.02% or whatever the heck it is this year, Trump would easily win. That's all you'd have to do.
Right. Okay. Wow. Okay. Now, the other state that has a recount going on right now is Wisconsin. We haven't heard a lot about that. I saw a lot of the liberal triumphal headlines saying that Trump spent all of this money for a recount, and the result was that Biden's lead only got bigger. That was the big lead. I think he expanded his lead by 160 votes or something in Milwaukee County. But I did see a report of lawyers who are filing something there, some kind of lawsuit, because there were 160,000 illegally cast ballots. Does this sound like this is actually going to go anywhere, or should we just forget about Wisconsin because it looks like it's going to be really hard to overcome the barriers in that state? What do you think?
If we're going to get anywhere in the other states, I think we will get somewhere in Wisconsin, because I think the other states, it's all going to come down to the Supreme Court. And if it's the same type of ballot fraud in Wisconsin as we're seeing in these other states, it doesn't make any sense to exclude Wisconsin.
All right. I don't really have a lot about Wisconsin other than the fact that they had the recount. And the question is that they went through the records and they found that there were 160,000 ballots that didn't go through the very elaborate certification process or application process that a voter has to go through, because Wisconsin has the strictest voter ID laws in the country, especially if you're voting absentee or voting by mail. So let's go now to your favorite state, the great state of Arizona, the state of the Grand Canyon. Just, you know the most about this, so tell us where it's at. I know you started at the beginning about that, but other people may have joined in now. Tell us where Arizona stands. Is there any chance with this state? Most of the commentary I see seems to indicate that Arizona is beyond Trump's grasp. But what do you think?
I disagree. And, maybe a week or two ago, I might have thought that, we were out of Trump's grasp because the final counting looked like it was not going to change. It was down to 10,000 lead by Biden. But all these other factors have come into play. Governor Ducey has said he's not going to call it for Biden yet. And the legislator isn't giving up. They're starting their hearings on Monday. And we have a tremendous state Republican Party led by Kelly Ward that's not giving up. And they've filed at least one or two lawsuits at this point. And I can't believe all the people I'm hearing now who are going to be coming into the state on Monday for the legislative hearings. We've got incredible pressure going on. So I don't think it's lost, and everybody knows. I mean, I don't know about those other swing states, but Arizona has never been a swing state. We have been so solidly conservative. All of our other races across the state went for Republicans. We held on to the state legislature. Everyone you predicted was going to lose actually won here in Arizona. So everyone knows there's massive felony fraud. Nobody's giving up. And, unlike some of these other swing states, we have a solid conservative base here that is not giving up. They are sinking in. They are digging in their heels. And, thank goodness we don't have a bunch of rhinos controlling all the people that get to make the calls here.
All right. Well, one thing I just don't understand is why is it that I follow the news as closely as I can. And you mentioned voter fraud. I just didn't get reports about all of those things. I mean, from the stories coming from Milwaukee and Atlanta and Philadelphia and Detroit were so stark. It was almost like a satire. I felt like I was watching a slapstick comedy in terms of the ridiculousness of it. But we didn't really hear that from Arizona. So, I mean, where is the reversal going to come from with the votes? Where was the fraud?
Well, the main part of fraud that, we're alleging here is that the signatures were not matched on the envelopes. And I can't remember the number, but it was something like maybe 60,000. I mean, way more than enough to match that 10,000. And that's not all. There's more. 44% of people surveyed in Arizona said they received a ballot when they didn't request one. And that's against the law here in Arizona to automatically send a ballot to someone. So, they're coming out, the types of fraud are coming out, but they're not all exactly the same. And maybe that's because only Dominion machines were used in Maricopa County. They weren't used in the rest of the state.
Okay. All right. So we have these 5 states taken care of. Let's go on to Nevada. Nevada's different because this is a case a court agreed to hear the evidence, correct? Does this look like
it did, but I'm worried because they didn't even schedule the hearing until December 3rd. We are running out of time.
Right. And the thing about it is that sometimes what happens is it's like what happened with the Third Circuit Court of Appeals. They grant you a hearing because they want to go through the motion to slap it down, right? So they can cover their bases. Does that look like what's happening in Nevada, or is Nevada pretty much just not even part of the equation right now? I know that Richard Grinnell was out there and he was doing all these things. So there were some big guns that we sent out to Nevada, but it just seems like that's kind of beyond the strategical bucket right now. I don't know. What do you think?
I've heard the opposite. I've heard that Nevada is one of the 4 key swing states right now that we have to look at. And part of that is because the numbers are so blatant. What was it? 30,000 people voted who no longer lived in the state. That's enough. That's pretty black and white. That's enough to reverse Biden's win. So I definitely haven't given up on it. But you do bring up a really good point. Everyone keeps saying, well, I'm going to accept the election if we don't win in the courts. Well, what if the courts are playing all these games? I think clearly that federal district court judge in Nevada is playing a game by not scheduling the hearing until December 3rd. They're just going to ride out the clock.
Okay. Well, lastly, what do you think about these lawsuits that are being proposed or have been filed? And I saw Virginia and Minnesota and New Mexico. That surprised me. Those were all places where people have come forward with some evidence that those may not have been won by Biden either, even though we didn't focus on them, but there were a lot of suspicious things in all those three states. And then you have deep blue states like Massachusetts. There's some talk about people challenging what's going on in New York. Actually, New York is very suspicious because outside of New York City, there was a huge sweep of those upstate counties. I don't know if you're familiar with upstate New York. I grew up in Buffalo, which is in Erie County. And when I was growing up, this was so blue that they went for Walter Mondale in 1984. I mean, who voted for Walter Mondale? But he won in the area of Buffalo. But on the end of election night, it was 50.1% had gone for Biden, and all of the counties surrounding were all deep red, 75% for Trump. This is wild. I don't know how this could have happened, but apparently the last time I looked, New York still has not counted something to the order of 25% of the ballots. So they might be hiding something there even. So what would you say to people about the blue states? Is it worth it going to the trouble? I interviewed that Filipino informant and he talked about what was going on in California. Is it worth it for us to go after some of those blue states where we know we're not going to be able to flip the election, but maybe we can light a fire under some of these people to get these election shenanigans cleaned up? What do you think?
Well, I think it's great because it adds momentum and it, gives more credibility to the accusations of voter fraud in other states. However, if it takes away resources and money from the lawsuits going on in these swing states, then don't do it. This has got to be completely third parties that are, filing these lawsuits and getting money from somewhere else. Don't take it from the, base of voters that we need to give money for these key swing state lawsuits.
All right. Well, let me ask you also, this is speculative. This is not something that I have any proof of, but I got the feeling like the lawyers, Trump has these different lawyers. I was upset when Powell was the subject of that press release where they said she was removed from it. But it almost looked to me like there were lawyers who were out there in the public who were on Trump's side, but who were counseling him a kind of weak-willed legal strategy that, in my mind, sounded a lot like the kind of strategies that they put forward when there were fights about gay marriage, where these different legal aid societies wanted to get donations from conservatives, but then they had these very weak arguments. But then everything changed once the Pennsylvania legislature hearing was set up. And I get the feeling like what's really the game changer here is that the mass of Trump voters are not going to put up with any talking outside of both sides of your mouth of the people at the top in the conservative movement. If you're going to try to play games with us, you're going to pay a price, because the Trump base is so energized right now and so devoted to seeing this through. What do you think? Am I imagining it, or does it seem like there was some waffling among the lawyers, or do you think that they were consistent from the beginning? I'm just curious.
Oh, no, there definitely is waffling going on. And, that's the personality of a lot of lawyers, that you don't go into law necessarily because you're principled. You go into law because you can argue either side. You're going to have clients that want to hire you on either side. So, look at Trump's top attorney, Dershowitz, for example. I mean, you see how he's talking now. He's not definitely talking like we should go all the way. I mean, he's kind of going back and forth because, that's how a lot of lawyers think. And it drives me crazy. And, that's a big part of the reason I got out of law, because I don't compromise. I've got one way that I think is going to work, and I'm going to stick with that. And you're not going to be able to buy me. And, a lot of these lawyers, too, you have to realize they're scared. They know that Democrats are going to come after them and try to disbar them. They've already filed motions to disbar attorneys in like 4 different states, like 22 different attorneys, in addition to Giuliani. But you're right. It sends a bad signal, because look what we have going on in Georgia now. You have a lot of MAGA people saying they're not even going to participate in the Senate race because, they think the rhinos just sold us out, and they don't even trust Republicans to be in charge anymore.
Right. Yeah. Well, okay. One last question. What happens if Biden is sworn in to office in January of 2021? What kind of presidency will he have? How will he govern the country? Will he ever be able to win back the cooperation of us, the Trump base? Does he need us? Is there any way to win us back? What's the future hold for him if he gets sworn in January? What do you think?
Oh, I'm completely negative about it. I mean, nobody wanted him because he's that bad. He only got in by, felony election fraud. So he's going to run like a tyrant because he knows that he can get reelected easily through election fraud because we won't have stopped it. So he's going to be scary. He's going to make Obama look like a conservative. And he is not going to bring over Republicans. We are going to, have a bigger base of conservatives than we've ever had once he gets in office. But it's not going to matter, because if we give up this fight, he's just going to get reelected. And I am scared to see what's going to happen, because what's going to happen. They're going to come after us outspoken conservatives first. Then they're going to go after the mom and pop. Then they're going to go after the people who aren't even on social media, but they're going to dig them up and find them too. It's just going to be a step towards socialism and communism.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Rachel. Let's see what happens. You're giving it a 30% chance that Trump's going to get sworn in January.
20.
Yeah. I'm not a betting man, so I'm just going to let other people bet and see. But thank you very much for sharing all of that. And I hope to have you on again soon. Thanks.
Appreciate it, Bobby. God bless.
Yeah, thanks.